All right, AP Scholars, Mr. Beamer here. Welcome back to another video. Chapter 13, we're going to start that, pages 256 to 265. We continue our journey in period 4. And this is called The Rise of Jacksonian Democracy from the years 1824 to 1830. I want to thank our intro music from the 1980s band Aha. Aha. I bet your parents probably remember that one or sing along with you if they were in the room, because I know I was. Here's a quote from Andrew Jackson. It's long. It's interesting. Let's read it on your own. And here's Jackson with a gun, and he was a tough man, Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory. Section of reading is Politics for the People. A couple important concepts in this section. All right, politics was supposed to favor the voting masses. Okay, so in theory of democracy, everybody should have a chance to vote. In the West, a man was well qualified for office if he was a great military commander or a good Native American fighter such as Andrew Jackson. So a lot of the politicians from the West definitely had military background. Still, in the early 1820s, our government was led by the leading citizens, the wealthier citizens, the ones that have been in politics the longest. However, a good thing was starting to happen in the 1820s. The common man, I would highlight that, the common man was moving to the center of the political stage because now, and I would highlight this, more states were dropping the property requirements for voting. Okay, and so basically by the 1820s, if you were a man, you could vote regardless of if you had property. Vermont, it's not important to know, but they were the first one to allow all white men to vote. And highlight this term, new democracy. The increase in voting for the common person, for men, regardless of property, is called new democracy, an important term. All right, let's nourish some new democracy with some good ingredients. It's not even funny. Okay, market economy. Highlight this one, please. Important term. Market economy relates to the economy was becoming more about trade and transportation and selling of goods to other people instead of trying to do subsistence farming and living on your own. So the Panic of 1819, this was from the last chapter, you should know about that. That did affect many people, and a lot of people were unhappy with the banks, especially the bus, and speculation of land. The wealthier people, many of the speculators were selling land off, and it was not working out for many people because they were buying land at relatively higher prices, and then the value of their lands went down and they lost their farms. I also talked about Missouri Compromise last chapter, showed that Southerners, that politics was important to protect slavery. So Missouri Compromise showed the South, the slave owners, that politics is the only way that they can keep slavery. I'd highlight this next part. Voter turnout rose dramatically throughout the 1820s. Only 25% of eligible voters voted in 1824, but that increased dramatically throughout the 1820s and 30s. And so by 1840, 78% of all eligible voters were voting. And so politics really started to become even more important to many Americans. And finally, nominating the presidential candidates, there was a new method for that. The National Convention was used by 1831, and that is what we have today. National conventions will nominate for the Republicans or Democrats their candidate. Usually it happens over a weekend in a major city, and these national conventions began in 1831. All right, very important section in A push, the Adams-Clay corrupt bargaining. So the election of 1824, I would highlight this, maybe write this here, the election of 1824 highlighted four people. Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, who's not that important, and John Quincy Adams. Okay, so these four men were trying to replace James Monroe as the next president. And all the men did claim to be Republicans or Democratic Republicans. So all four were Democratic Republicans. We know that this is the end of the era of good feelings when we only had one political party in place. There were still some oddities in these early elections. For example, John C. Calhoun, not a fan. He appeared as VP for both Adams and Jackson, which I don't think would happen probably today. Anyway, the four candidates took votes away from each other, and so the Electoral College did not produce a majority winner. Even though Andrew Jackson did have the most votes, he was the most votes popularly elected by the people, he did not have enough in the Electoral College. So now, in our country, because the Constitution says that if the Electoral College cannot decide the presidency, it's going to go to the House of Representatives. And in the House of Representatives, they're going to have a vote to decide who is going to win the election. Continuing this section, so the House of Reps does decide the election, and Crawford drops out, so that's why he's not too important. But Henry Clay, who was also one of the four candidates, and he's an important person, we already talked about him a little bit with the American system, he drops out as well, and he decides to swing his support to John Quincy Adams. And so the House of Representatives which Henry Clay was a leader in the House. He was a leading politician, and he helped persuade many members of the House to select John Quincy Adams as the president in the 1824 election. And that's all fine and good, and nothing really wrong with that. However, several days later, Henry Clay becomes the Secretary of State for John Quincy Adams. And in our country's history, many of the early presidents did serve as Secretary of State. That's like a stepping stone to becoming the president. And so Jackson and his people were going nuts, and they cried out it was a corrupt bargain. So Jackson was mad, and he basically told John Quincy Adams, come on, take on me, I'll be back. That's why we have the song from Aha. You get it now? Andrew Jackson says, I'm going to be back. You're going to take on me in the next election, 1828. And finally, just to clarify, the 1824 election was not decided by the corrupt bargain. The House of Representatives, they actually did decide who the president was, but we always associate the corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay in the 1824 election. Okay, next section is about John Quincy Adams and all of his creative-looking apparel. Anyway, John Quincy Adams ranks as one of the most successful Secretary of States. You should automatically think of John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State. He helped create a doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine, so he was very great at being Secretary of State. However, he's considered by historians, it's historiography, however, one of the worst presidents. His personality was not very fit for being president. He was sarcastic, he was irritable, stubborn, did not compromise very well with other people, and so not considered a good president. And most importantly, probably, is he was not a man for the people. The common people were not behind him, and we know from earlier that the common man really started to vote more in the 1820s because of the new idea called New Democracy. The next two slides are going to be about the tricky Tariff of Abominations in 1828. This is a very important event in APUSH. Have to know the Tariff of Abominations. Abominations is a word that means not good on a very high level. Anyway, Congress increased the tariff, which we know is a tax on imported goods, from 25 to 37%. And the tariff has always been an issue ever since Hamilton created it in the 1790s. The Tariff of 1816 raised tariffs to protect manufacturing, and the tariff rates continue to go up in 1837 because of this tariff. So this is the Tariff of 1828, but it's also called the Tariff of Abominations. Southerners were very unhappy, with the tariff. They want a lower tariff, mostly because they have to buy manufactured goods from Europe or from America. And if there's a tariff, these manufactured goods are going to be higher in price, and makes the Southerners unhappy about it. On the flip side, the Northeast, New England region, was very big into manufacturing, and they wanted a higher tariff to protect against their manufacturing. So right now we can clearly see a division between the North and South, and it's not even over slavery right now. It's about the tariff of 1828, the Tariff of Abominations. And this tariff becomes the key issue in the election of 1828 between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Continuing this section, South Carolina, they're going to be around for a while. We're going to talk about South Carolina, and they definitely are willing to raise their voices and cause issues and conflict in America before the Civil War. So if there's a question about people unhappy before the Civil War, pick South Carolina. The reason why many in South Carolina were unhappy at this time is because they said the federal power were encroaching states' rights. So the federal government was becoming way too powerful for the states' rights. And so this is an additional issue besides just the tariff itself, that the federal government was too powerful. And they probably in South Carolina were not too fond of John Marshall, although we love him, because he was more for a stronger federal government. Lastly, this section does mention a slave revolt, and this is the Denmark-Vesey slave revolt, and it's kind of an odd place for it, but we'll mention it here. He was a free black, and he tried to incite a slave revolt in South Carolina. There it is again. And he was captured, executed before the revolt ever happened. And this is one of the few pre-Civil War slave revolts that I want you to know. And I put this table over here on the right-hand side to show some major slave revolts. Okay, the ones I think you should be aware of in colonial America, briefly mentioned the New York Slave Revolt 1712, the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, again in South Carolina. So we had a couple of slave revolts before the Revolution, but after the Revolution, I want you to know three. 1800, a slave named Gabriel Prosser started a slave revolt, and it was unsuccessful. And then the one right here, Denmark-Vesey, 1822, also unsuccessful. And the most important slave revolt that you must know, which is in a later chapter, is the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831. This is going to be a must-know, and this is the most serious slave revolt because it was the most deadly towards American whites. I'll talk about that later. And so just the bottom line for pretty much all these slave revolts in America, they were all unsuccessful. All right, the next section is the tariff yoke in the South, and we talk about the Southerners did not like the higher tariff, and they felt it discriminated against them. And in your book, there's a good example talking about the shoemaker on page 263. Basically, the South had to buy manufactured goods because they had no factories in the South. They were pretty much all farming. So manufactured goods become very expensive for them because of the higher tariff. And so they're going to pay more for the shoes, and it's going to make England unhappy because the South are not going to buy as much English goods. And so because the South is not buying as many English textiles, such as shoes or clothes, the English are not going to buy as much American goods, and especially cotton. They're going to buy less Southern cotton. So the South is going to be hurt both as consumers buying the more expensive manufactured goods and also as producers because they're not selling as much of their crop because England is not buying it. So in the end, the South do not like the tariff and they find it tariffable, and it really hurts their economy, makes them mad, causing more tension with the North. There he is. I just like looking at him. He's just something about him. John C. Calhoun, what are you thinking? Oh my goodness. All right, so continuing this section, John C. Calhoun, guess what state he was from? Surprise, he was from South Carolina. Okay, what a shock. Anyway, he does lead the fight against the Tariff of 1828, even though he's vice president under John Q. Adams, and he's also going to be vice president under Jackson in his first term. He is very unhappy with the tariff, and he writes something called the South Carolina Exposition. I would highlight this, and I would also highlight the year 1828. He writes this in response to the Tariff of Abominations, and he calls for the word nullification. We've seen that word before with Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Basically, he says that South Carolina, and especially the southern states, should nullify the tariff, okay? And unfortunately for big John C. Calhoun, only South Carolina actually considered it. No other state did nullify it because they were happy that Jackson won that election and they weren't ready to join John C. Calhoun's nullification idea yet. Okay, the final section is going whole hog for Jackson in 1828, and this is about the election of 1828. And so Andrew Jackson, we know, was unhappy with the election of 1824. He thought it was stolen from him because he won the popular vote. And so he basically started campaigning for the 1828 election the day John Q. Adams was sworn into office in 1825. And so during this 4-year stretch of John Quincy Adams' presidency, the Democratic Republicans were divided. The era of good feelings is over. They were divided into two new political parties, the National Republicans, which was what Adams was in the 1828 election, and now the new party, the Democrats, of Andrew Jackson, and this party is still around today. This election also saw a lot of mudslinging in the 1820 election between these two people, and it was pretty ugly. Adams labeled Jackson's mother a prostitute. Not very nice. Adams also attacked Jackson and his wife Rachel. And I love Rachel Jackson. I think I feel for her. I think she had a good heart and something. She was a special person. All right. So anyway, Adams basically says Rachel, his wife, was not officially divorced from her first marriage before marrying Andrew Jackson. And Rachel, unfortunately, died during the election process. So she died before Jackson won the presidency. And Andrew Jackson blamed John Quincy Adams for her death. Okay, and they say that Rachel died of a broken heart because of all the criticism of her. Can I get a aw? But Andrew Jackson did sling some of his own mud as well, and he accused Adams of using large sums of money from the government and using a servant girl for the mistress of the Russian nobleman. So basically, Andrew Jackson, this is from your text, I'm not making this up, called John Quincy Adams a pimp. We're going to move on. Jackson does end up winning the election of 1828, and we'll get to that in our next video.